Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first installment of Recovering Women's Legacies, Artists, Dealers, Collectors, and Patrons. I'm Elizabeth Gareyev, Executive Director of the Wildenstein-Platner Institute. On behalf of my colleagues at the WPI, I'm grateful for the Frick Center for the History of Collecting for co-organizing this month-long lunchtime series with us. Over the coming weeks, each Wednesday, we'll be talking about women who shaped the history of art over the 19th and 20th centuries and how their stories and those of others like them have yet to be fully investigated and celebrated. We hope that this program inspires researchers to take a closer look at the contributions of women whose names have been glossed over in art historical narratives. Today, we're going to begin with the case studies presented by the archivists of the WPI and the Frick. During the first half of the program, my colleagues Sandrine Kanak, Director of Digital Archival Projects, and Samantha Rowe, Digital Archivist and Research Associate, will speak about Complicated Legacies, a look at women dealers and collectors from the WPI Digital Archives. Then we'll hear from the Frick's Sally Brazil, Associate Chief Librarian for Archives and Records Management. She'll be focusing on Helen Clay Frick as a collector and patron, and the women who sold art to Henry Clay Frick. Each presentation will last about 20 minutes, giving us time for a 15-minute Q&A at the end of the hour. So please be sure to write your questions in the Q&A box. And we'll also be placing a link to register for next week's session in the chat box. You'll also be able to see closed captioning in the closed captioning section. If you look in the toolbox at the bottom of the screen, you'll be able to find that. Without further ado, let's begin. Sandrine?
Thank you. Here we go. So in today's presentation, I will focus on some of the women collectors mentioned in the inventories of the French art experts Eugène and Jules Ferral. The father and son were active in Paris during the mid-19th to mid-20th century. The Ferral collection is now available on the WPI Digital Archives and contains 226 appraisal and inventory dossiers organized by collector's name. This dossier provides significant information for market studies and provenance research on important Parisian collections, including those of Louis Lacaze, Théophile Thoré, Jacques-Victor de la Béraudière, and Marie-Frédérique de Rézé. In fact, and unsurprisingly so, the bulk of these inventories document art collections owned by men. Yet out of these 226 dossiers, about 75 bear a woman's name. Of course, because the Ferral drew inventories at women's request does not necessarily mean that this woman assembles the collections themselves. For instance, the collection may have been bequeathed by a spouse or a family member. This, to me, though, already signals an important question. What does a collector do? Is it only a matter of purchase, in that only the person who chooses and buys the art can be called a collector? Or does the act of caring, of stewardship, or placing a collection in a public institution constitute collecting? Certainly, these functions are not mutually exclusive, but as we will see over the course of this webinar series, when it comes to women, such distinctions have been used to downplay, if not outright ignores, women's roles in the history of collecting. But let's go back to the 75 women whose collections were inventoried by the Ferral in an attempt to better understand who they were. I have organized them in 5 working categories, and I was only able to do so thanks to the formidable research gathered by my colleagues Sophie Pietri and Laura Espagnon. First, we have the professional woman, and by that I mean women who had their own sometimes successful careers, such as Comtesse Marie Dagout, a Franco-German Romantic author and historian, also known by her pen name Daniel Stern, or the French actress and composer Marie-Antoine Legru, Marie-Antoinette Legru, who used the pseudonym Louise Urgel. We also have Regina Chantrelle, one of the four Callot sisters, who founded the leading fashion house Callot Sur in the 1920s and 10 and 20s. And fun fact, Isabelle Huppert, the famous French actress, is a direct descendant of one of the Callot sisters. The second category consists of women from the European aristocracy who established residency in Paris at the time. We have here the Polish heiress Marie-Rose Branicka, the Irish-born Harriet Ledru-Rollin, or Fanny Rebecca Pereire, niece and wife, yes, niece and wife, of Isaac Pereire, a Portuguese entrepreneur and deputy in Bonaparte's regime. A third category will be that of the wives of the French bourgeoisie, which include Caroline Pauline Bourdon, wife of an engineer, Elisabeth Octavie Schoeffer, wife of a stockbroker, or Marie-Louise Détailleur, wife of an architect. And as you can see from the lack of pictures and photograph or images of this woman, it becomes really hard to encounter biographical records on this woman, besides dates of birth and death, or a marriage certificate, or their place of residence. The fourth category consists of what we may call the legacy builders. Catherine Caroline Cogniet, wife of the painter Léon Cogniet, contributed to the legacy of her husband by bequeathing hundreds of his works to the Musée d'Orléans, which went on to study and assemble many exhibitions of Léon Cogniet's oeuvre. And I should also add that Catherine Caroline Cogniet was a painter and an artist in her own right, as you can see in this image on the screen of her painting. And her work is currently on view at the Musée du Luxembourg in Paris in an exhibition titled Women's Painters. Other women contributed to art education and appreciation among the public. Marie-Jeanne Louise de Pastoret inherited an important collection from her parents, which she installed at the Château de Moreuil after her husband's death. And as you can read on the cover of the catalog documenting her collection, she opened the castle twice a week so that the public could see the works. The last category relates to women and the colonial project. In this category, we may find women like Mathilde Kestner-Charras, who lent Nicolas de Largilliere's portrait of Madame Titon de Cogny to an 1874 charitable exhibition in support of the colonization of Algeria. For art historians and researchers who study women's contribution to art history of the period, this brief overview only confirms the following 2 points. One, women did purchase, sell, donate, and care for works of art. Some even sued unscrupulous dealers, as the correspondence from Regina Chantrelle's file shows. Chantrelle bought a pastel of Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun's portrait of Elizabeth de France, thinking it was made in the 18th century. Chantrelle later sued the dealer, and Jules Ferral was appointed to be the expert on the case. Ferral's expertise determined that the pastel was in fact a recent copy, as Chantrelle had claimed, and the dealer was sentenced to refund Chantrelle the amount of the sale with interest and to pay an additional fee as compensation. What these records do not tell us, however, is if Chantrelle bought this reproduction of a portrait of a woman by a woman artist whose painting of the Queen Marie-Antoinette in robe en chemise was so controversial it had to be removed from the 783 salon for her personal collection or for one of the Callot Sur sales room as a means to hint at the innovative quality of the sisters' design. And you can see on the right side of the screen a photograph of the Maison Worth sales room, in which you can see a reproduction of Vigée-Lebrun official portrait of Marie Antoinette. In fact, the second point this overview was meant to highlight is that documents and records on women in the arts are often scarce. Researchers must use archival materials creatively, and as other presentation in this webinar series will show, sometimes against the grain. Now, if studying women in art history has us rethink our research methods, what else should we be rethinking? I am going to end with a few questions to which there is no easy response, but that we should nonetheless try to address. First, how should we problematize the contribution of these women who, like the ones from the pharaoh inventories, are all white and wealthy, with fortunes often tied to the exploitation of labor and resources across the French colonial empire? Two, in telling these women's stories, how can we avoid the double bind of the either victim or heroine narratives? Three, is the study of women's contribution necessarily a feminist project? Four, since the answer to the next question really shapes the scope of the research, should we also ask ourselves, like others have done before us, what is a woman? And lastly, because the historical margins can be sites of disempowerment and limitation, but also spaces of opportunity and experimentation, how can the study of women help us open up definition and challenge long-held assumption about the roles of artists, dealers, collectors, and patrons, regardless of their gender? I'm going to end here, and I'm hoping that we may be able to address some of these questions in the Q&A. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn the digital floor over to my colleague, Samantha. Thank you very much.
Hello. For the remainder of our presentation, I will focus on a case study about the elusive Miss E. Barlow, a prominent yet scarcely documented female partner and auctioneer at Sotheby & Co. in London, England during the early 20th century. But before I do, I would like to offer some background information about the process which led me to discover Miss Barlow. As I prepared for today's webinar, I knew that I was committed to introducing a case study that ideally focused on women as auctioneers, or alternatively to highlight women who might have held noteworthy roles at auction houses during the late 19th or early 20th century. However, I came to realize that I might have been overly ambitious with attempting to uncover names of women, let alone just one to form the basis of a case study. I realized that the identities of women in the art market have been traditionally masked due to legal and social statuses, and more often because society precluded or discouraged them from participating in professional activities, particularly in the 19th century. Early in my research process, I had many suppositions, but no tangible leads. And I considered that even if there had been a woman who maintained this sort of role in the art market, to find her name would be another obstacle, as women often use pseudonyms or the names of male family members to conceal their identities, making it even more difficult or impossible to track. As I was conducting background research on this period, I was introduced to dreadful laws such as the Napoleonic Civil Code of 1804, enforced by the French government, that further prevented women from having freedom to conduct business independently, since according to the Civil Code, they were subordinate to their husbands and fathers. Since women were considered legal minors who lost control of their children and property, to obtain access to money and the acquisition and disposition of property, they were required to get an approval from either their fathers or husbands. Similarly, in the United States, women were also subject to coverture, originally adopted from English common law, which is the legal subordination of a married woman to her husband, which prevailed until the mid-19th century, when a series of Married Women's Property Acts were gradually introduced to expand the rights of married women to act as independent agents and legal concepts. However, what interested me most about the French Civil Code was an unusual exception identified as Article 220, which granted female merchants, including the wives of shopkeepers, to retain the right to enter into contracts to buy and sell at will and to engage not only their own assets, but those of their husbands. Having conducted this background research made me ever more determined to find a female presence in the WPI's sales catalogs database, other than only being identified as the property of a lady or widow of. Which ultimately led me to discover Marie Rosalie Serrure, who lived and worked in Paris during the late 19th and early 20th century as an expert for the prominent auction house Hotel Drouot, specializing in coins and antiquities. I am most grateful to Dr. Veronique Chagnon-Burke, the co-founder of WADA, the Women Art Dealers Digital Archives, who will also participate in a talk later this month as part of this webinar series, for her recommendation to research Marie Rosalie, because despite not being able to generate any relevant search results using the WPI's database, knowing that a Marie Rosalie existed during this period gave me hope that there were most certainly others just like her. In the case of Marie Rosalie, it was also a challenge to source information about her, even though I was fortunate to have her full name at my disposal. But as you can see here, her name is usually printed and represented in authority record files as Madame Raymond Serrure, or in other instances as Veuve de Raymond Serrure, which is the widow of Raymond Serrure, and never by her given name. So once again, I returned to the WPI sales catalog database to reattempt to source a name for my case study, and then lo and behold, I noticed the name Miss E. Barlow printed on the title and cover page of a Sotheby & Co. catalog. And as I continued to search in our database, I realized her name appeared in other Sotheby catalogs from around 1924 to 1933. Of course, my immediate reaction was just pure excitement, knowing that I might have stumbled on a potential candidate for my case study. But then I began to pose questions, such as, who is this Miss E. Barlow? What was her role? How long had she worked at Sotheby? And more importantly, what led her to start working at the firm? But as I've encountered before, the lack of information prevented me from finding much information, as I only had her maiden name Barlow and a first initial E. There was neither information about her title nor her status at Sotheby. I came across a historical timeline of milestones on Sotheby's website, which did mention that select women were hired to work at the firm during World War I, and highlights a woman known as E. Millicent Sowerby as the first female book cataloger in 1916. And though quite interesting, there were no relevant results with this name in our database, and still no luck with finding anything about Miss E. Barlow. I was yet again very close to giving up on this lead until my colleagues came to the rescue, and together we were able to uncover E. Barlow. Catherine Evelyn Faithful Barlow, also known as Evelyn Barlow, was born on February 24th, 1880 in Islington, Middlesex, England, and was the sister of Sir Clement Anderson Montague Barlow, a barrister, politician, and a partner and director from 1909 until 1929 at Sotheby, Wilkinson and Hodge, which would later be reorganized as Sotheby & Co. She was educated at the highly regarded boarding school for upper middle class young women known as Highfield in Hendon, located north of London. She was the younger daughter of the Very Reverend William Hager Barlow, Dean of Peterborough Cathedral, with whom she worked for as his secretary and accompanied him on his travels around the world. In 1915, Evelyn gave a series of lectures on her tour of Russia and Finland, which provided her valuable experience in public speaking. From 1915 to 1917, she worked as the National Corresponding Secretary to the Young Women's Christian Association. In 1918, Montague recruited her and her sister Margaret to work at Sotheby during World War I, when there had been a severe labor shortages, which opened up opportunities for women in a variety of occupations, including at auction houses. Initially, Montague had Evelyn take over the role of Thomas Hodge, a partner of Sotheby, who by 1916 essentially retired from his work. Evelyn was responsible to oversee the work of experts, the sales of significant collections, which included overall accountability for the preparation of the sales catalogs, managing a large team of experts like Emily, Millicent Sowerby to ensure that the descriptions and estimates in the catalogs were accurate. Only after a few months, Evelyn began to observe how sales were conducted. Before she could work the rostrum herself, she was required to obtain an auctioneer's license. Evelyn ultimately obtained hers in 1918 and made her debut on the rostrum on July 22nd that same year. She was one of the first women in England, certainly in London, to hold a chattel auctioneer's license. This clipping from the Outlook describes her debut as an auctioneer in October 1918. Apparently, because of Evelyn, in 1920, the Auctioneers Institute decided to revise their rules to allow the admission of women. After she earned her license, Evelyn was in charge of the pictures and prints department, but she also took sales of coins and Japanese art. By 1926, she became a director and full partner of the firm, the only woman to 4 men, and one to also earn a sizable holding of shares. Unfortunately, this all ended in 1933 when Evelyn was forced to retire. Only after working for Sotheby for 15 years due to the impact of the stock market crash of 1929, which affected Sotheby's sales drastically, and she was encouraged to resign in order to save another director's salary. Her departure marked the start of a 43-year hiatus in women wielding the gavel at Sotheby's, and it was not until 1976 that the 24-year-old Libby Howie was documented as Sotheby's first woman auctioneer. It is unfortunate, yet not uncommon, that Evelyn's accomplishments and role at Sotheby's has been forgotten. Frank Herman, the official historian of Sotheby's, explains that a fire in the 19th century destroyed most of the firm's records, but this should not be the sole reason for a lack of documentation. I do hope that this presentation inspires new avenues of scholarship for others to dig deeper into the past to uncover more about Evelyn Barlow, but also others who have made equal or more contributions to the field and whose names have also been lost. I thank you so much for joining us today. I will now turn it over to Sally Brazil, who will begin her portion of the presentation.
Okay, hello everybody. Let me get my presentation up here. Hello everybody. It's nice to have all of you join us. I am very glad to be part of this series, and I'm going to speak primarily about the founder of the Frick Art Reference Library and collector, Helen Clay Frick. But I will also address archival holdings that we have on women dealers and women artists in the Frick collection of Frick Art Reference Library archives. The archives of the Frick collection house over 4,000 linear feet of archival materials, including a very complete archive of the Frick family, notably for Henry Clay Frick and his daughter, Helen Clay Frick. Today's focus and virtual show and tell is on Helen Clay Frick and her extensive paper trail, archival paper trail, which documents her interests as an art collector, art patron, and supporter of arts education and research, most notably in her founding and support of the Frick Art Reference Library in New York City. I begin with this portrait of Henry Clay Frick and his daughter Helen, painted in 1910 by Edmund Tarbell in order to emphasize the close connection father and daughter shared. Helen Clay Frick adored her father, and the bond they shared in their love of fine art served to guide her personal and philanthropic endeavors for her entire life. Over the course of her life, she observed her father's art collecting, although she is not known to have influenced many of his purchases, and the construction and furnishing of family homes in Pittsburgh, New York City, and Pride's Crossing, Massachusetts. She considered herself, once her mother had passed away, as the person best qualified to preserve his memory and to carry out his wishes through her involvement with the development of the Frick collection and the evolution of the museum's art holdings. Beginning shortly after her father's death in 1919 and lasting until her own death in 1984, Helen Clay Frick put together an art collection of her own, which she hung in her various residences and as well as at institutions she founded. envisioned and built the Frick Art Reference Library, served as a trustee of the Frick Collection, and guided its acquisition committee over several decades, funded the Fine Arts Department at the University of Pittsburgh, and also the construction of the university's Frick Fine Arts Building, and built her own museum, the Frick Art Museum, on the family's Pittsburgh estate. She also acquired and supported the buildings in Western Pennsylvania that were associated with Henry Clay Frick's birthplace, now operated as West Overton Village, and funded projects to encourage leisure activities for young working women. And we are fortunate at the Frick to have detailed documentation of all aspects of these projects in the archives. The Frick Collection, which covers a block on Fifth Avenue between East 70th and East 71st Street in New York City, while primarily a great monument to her father, also bears the marks of her years of involvement as a founding member of the museum's Board of Trustees. Frick himself only lived at the mansion at 1 East 70th Street for fewer than 6 years, from 1914 to 1919. Helen Clay Frick and her mother lived in the house until her mother's death in 1931, when the terms of Mr. Frick's will were implemented and plans to turn the house into a museum were developed. Miss Frick, along with her brother Childs Frick, was heavily involved in the design and construction process that culminated in the opening of the museum in 1935. We are fortunate to have in the archives a comprehensive record of the transformation of the house into the museum under the direction of Frederick Mortimer Clapp, the collection's first director, who was brought into the institution by Miss Frick herself from the University of Pittsburgh, where he had organized and run the university's Fine Arts Department. This is a plaster portrait bust of Helen Clay Frick that was sculpted by Malvina Hoffman in 1919 and was given to the Frick collection by her descendants in 2016, and it resides in the reading room of the Frick Art Reference Library. But beginning in 1922, once she had control of a great deal of inherited money, Miss Frick began to acquire art for herself and on behalf of the Frick collection. For several years, the museum's acquisition committee consisted of Miss Frick. Hers was the predominant voice when it came to bringing anything new into the museum, and she gravitated towards early Italian art and French sculpture and paintings. The former was a new interest that her father did not embrace as she did, and it is her influence that you see in the Frick's holdings in this area. She had little interest in adding works of art that deviated from the overall contours of the existing collection and made her opinions known candidly. She actually left the Board of Trustees over the matter of a bequest of objects from John D. Rockefeller Jr., a former trustee, that she did not want to accept, as she felt the objects and the gift weren't up to the standards her father had set. She was overruled by the other trustees, including her brother, and she resigned in 1961. This is the finding aid that you will find for her art collecting files that's on our website. This documents her purchases for herself and on behalf of the Frick, as well as works of art she was offered and declined, and objects she loaned for exhibitions. Her true art love was the sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon, and she devoted a great deal of time over the years to researching the artist and acquiring works of art by him for herself and for the Frick. At one point, she owned Houdon's correspondence, but returned it to the Municipal Library in Versailles after she had completed her research. Her research into Houdon, all 14 or so linear feet of it, is also in the archives. 2 Houdon works were added to the Frick collection's holdings in the 1930s, Diana the Huntress and a portrait bust of the Count of Miromesnil. And there are 2 additional Houdon busts at the Frick Art Museum in Pittsburgh. These works were all acquired for the Frick collection while Miss Frick served on the Frick collection board. They are iconic for the Frick collection, and people often are surprised to learn that they weren't acquired by Henry Clay Frick. In fact, over a third of the museum's holdings were acquired after Mr. Frick's death, and we continue to acquire works and fine and decorative arts. This is the Houdon Diana that I just mentioned, as well as Ingres' Countess de Haussonville, acquired in 1927, and the Annunciation by Lippi, acquired in 1924. And all 3 are very representative of Helen Clay Frick's art collecting interests. Beginning in 1935, we have many photographs of the interior of the Frick collection. However, we have none of the interiors of the house prior to 1927. An album of photographs taken in 1927 by Ira W. Martin, the photographer at the Frick Art Reference Library, shows most of the first and second floor rooms of the house from several angles, and it is believed that the art is hung as it was during Mr. Frick's lifetime, although the presumed later addition of numerous portraits and photographs of Mr. Frick throughout the spaces, they're everywhere. The entire album has been digitized and can be viewed at digitalcollections.frick.org. Miss Frick's personal rooms at 1 East 70th Street, and this is her sitting room shown here, are decorated with family portraits, photographs, mementos, mezzotints, and prints. Not seen here is a large portrait of her father also hanging in the sitting room. The portrait above the mantelpiece is of her sister, Martha, who died very young, and the small sculpture on the mantelpiece is the only substantial piece of art in the room. This is a portrait bust by her favorite artist, Houdon, and it is of the artist's daughter, Claudine Houdon, and it is now at the Frick Art Museum in Pittsburgh. Even as she continued to travel to Europe and Italy in particular in the 1920s and 30s, accompanied by or advised by art experts such as Bernard Berenson, F. Mason Perkins, Richard Offner, R. Langton Douglas, on the Italian legs of her journey of buying art for herself and suggesting pieces to acquire for the Frick collection, she also commissioned works of art to honor her parents, her father in particular, and to embellish the Frick Art Reference Library and the University of Pittsburgh Fine Arts Building. The latter two institutions are graced with replicas of Italian frescoes made by Nicholas Lokoff, a Russian artist living in Florence, who she met in the 1920s and with whom she had a lively correspondence preserved in the archives over the course of a decade or so. The pastel seen here is of Adelaide Frick, Miss Frick's mother, and it's by Elizabeth Shumatoff, who Miss Frick commissioned in the 50s, also in the 30s, a little earlier, to draw portraits of her mother, father, and other family members. And she commissioned the pastels generally to give as gifts to family members. Although the portrait of this portrait has been seen in the Boucher room at the Frick collection. There's a couple of copies of this. Helen Clay Frick also had a close friendship with sculptor Malvina Hoffman, probably beginning with their shared Red Cross activities in World War I. Miss Frick commissioned Hoffman to sculpt posthumous busts of her father, as well as a portrait medallion and a death mask. The bust seen here is currently located at Frick Madison, our temporary home, while the Frick Mansion undergoes a building enhancement and expansion. Miss Frick also asked Hoffman to design a fountain and a pediment for the Frick Art Reference Library, neither of which were executed, as well as other sculptures for the Frick family mansion in Massachusetts. The portrait bust of Miss Frick seen in a previous slide was commissioned by Henry Clay Frick, and the marble delivered to Miss Frick after he died. Apparently, she disliked the sculpture and destroyed it sometime after 1956, either personally or ordered it done. In any case, the plaster version we have was given to us in 2016. Clearly, there's something of a story here to be explored further, I suspect. In addition to the bust, Malvina Hoffman's descendants also gave the collection a trove of Hoffman family manuscripts and photographs. However, the bulk of her archives are located at the Getty Research Institute. And I was fortunate to be able to review the holdings there in a trip a couple of years ago that concerned her connections to the Frick family. This well-known posthumous portrait of Henry Clay Frick is located at Frick in Pittsburgh, and it was painted by Gerald Kelly, who Miss Frick in 1923 commissioned to paint portraits of her father from photographs. Their contentious interactions over about a decade are documented in the art purchase files of Miss Frick. There was lots of confusion, disappointments, and ensuing arguments over payments. But I think the portrait's quite nice myself, but it was not pretty to get to that point, I think. She also commissioned Walter Gay in 1926 and in 1928 to paint 3 interiors of the Frick Mansion: the living hall, the Boucher room, and the Fragonard room, seen here. These paintings are located at the Frick Art Museum at Frick, Pittsburgh. And we at the Frick in New York are fortunate to have acquired an archive of Walter and Matilda Gay, including photographs, ephemera, and a run of Matilda Gay's diaries and their transcriptions detailing Walter Gay's artistic career and their active social lives in France and America. Perhaps one of the most interesting of Miss Frick's commissions, and virtually the only one not of her family or family real estate, was for this fresco, gracing the reading room of the Frick Art Reference Library, done by Nicholas Lakoff in Florence. Miss Frick visited his studio in 1928, presumably through an introduction by Bernard Berenson, and had him recreate the fresco by Lorenzetti, located in the lower chapel of the Church of St. Francis in Assisi. At the same time, she also commissioned a copy of Piero della Francesca's Resurrection for the University of Pittsburgh Fine Arts Department and Library. Lakoff's technique involved recreating the existing physical state of the fresco, working in the original fresco's location, which entailed working around tourists and religious schedules, and including lost sections and damage to the fresco. The archives contains letters to and from the artist to Miss Frick, detailing the progress of the library's fresco and the shipping and installation of it in the library's reading room in 1930. It was subsequently installed in the new library when it opened in 1935. It is currently deinstalled during the building project and will be reaffixed to the reading room wall when we return in a couple of years. While Miss Frick maintained her interest in acquiring art for the New York Frick, her legacy as a collector also endures at Frick, Pittsburgh, where the Frick's family home, Clayton, which is seen here, was restored with funds given by Miss Frick and the Helen Clay Frick Foundation, and which has been open to the public for the last several years. It is filled with art and furniture from the family's time there. The other building in this slide is a Frick Art Museum, opened in 1970, designed and built over a couple of years on the Clayton property after Miss Frick had a falling out with the University of Pittsburgh over the administrative direction to be undertaken at the university's Frick Fine Arts Building. She removed all of her loaned art and all of the administrative records and proceeded to build her own museum. She left installed at the Frick Fine Arts Building a series of frescoes she purchased in the 1950s from the estate of Nicholas Lakoff, and which were too firmly affixed to be moved. We are fortunate to have extensive archival documentation on both the Frick Fine Arts Building and the Frick Art Museum, as well as documentation on the Frick's Clayton home. Finding aids for all of these buildings are on the archive's website, and historic photographs of Clayton taken during the Frick's lives are available in our digital portal, or digitalcollections.frick.org. I would like to comment briefly on the archival materials we have for the two women art dealers who sold works of art to Henry Clay Frick, Alice Creelman and Virginia P. Bacon. The records of their dealings with Henry Clay Frick were digitized as part of a Carnegie Foundation-funded grant to digitize the art purchase files of Henry Clay Frick and can be found at our portal, digitalcollections.frick.org, and via links on the online finding aid. I would also like to point out a blog post written in 2016 by Olivia Hunt for the New York Art Resources Consortium, which gives an elegant and clear description of the lives of these two women. And there's a citation for that at the end of my last slide. Alice Creelman, pictured here, sold directly or as an intermediary to Henry Clay Frick a number of iconic paintings, including two that you see here. After the death of her journalist husband, Creelman worked hard to support her family and was fortunate to connect with other dealers, notably Sir Hugh Lane, with whom she did business. And after Lane's death, she was able to conclude sales of his paintings, often in conjunction with other dealers. And while she wrote continuously to Frick until his death, his responses to her offers were usually in the negative. Undeterred, Creelman also corresponded with Helen Clay Frick from 1924 to 1934, offering various works of art to her, all of which she rejected. Creelman's correspondence and payments from Frick have been digitized and are in our portal, and the back and forth with his daughter is not digitized but can be requested. Virginia P. Bacon, while not referring to herself as a dealer, did sell works of art from Edward C. Bacon, her brother-in-law, his art collection to Henry Clay Frick, as well as to others. Mrs. Bacon, a Vanderbilt descendant, inherited her brother-in-law's extensive art collection. And in addition to selling the Boucher Four Seasons and a painting by Sir Thomas Lawrence to Frick, also sold to other collectors, as well as donated works of art to museums and charitable organizations. Her correspondence with Frick is digitized and can be viewed in the portal. And while the Frick holds the records of art galleries, some, not too many, most of them, as has been mentioned before, were run by men. And one exception is the Schaefer Galleries, run together by Hans and Kate Schaefer from the 1920s until Mr. Schaefer's death in 1967, and then run by Kate Schaefer until her death in 2000. And while not extensive, the holdings here, there's a finding aid online for them, complement the gallery's records held at the Getty Research Institute and at the Archives of American Art. We do not hold extensive archives on women artists at the Frick. Neither Henry Clay Frick nor his daughter bought many works of art by women artists. In the case of Helen Clay Frick, she commissioned works from Malvina Hoffman and Elizabeth Shumatoff, but that is it as far as I am aware. Henry Clay Frick bought minor works from Mary Cassatt, Rosa Bonheur, and several watercolors by Dutch artist Margaretha Rosenboom. We do have small holdings on women artist records in some of our manuscript collections, notably our manuscript holdings for Sister Mary of the Compassion, formerly Constance Mary Rowe, and our College Art Association archives and American Art Association archives. Our photographs of artists, 2 examples shown here from 2 collections we hold, are digitized and available through the portal. Finally, we do collect scholars' research records on individual artists, and one such example is our research holdings donated by Anna Kleinman on the 18th century artist Rosalba Carriera. The finding aid for this collection is also online. And these 2 pastels by Carriera are a very recent acquisition at the Frick. They were a gift from Alexis Gregory. And here is my final slide, which is small, short bibliography, some sources, and if you have any information, please just contact archives@frick.org, and we will be happy to help you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. Thank you, Samantha and Sandrine. I'd like to bring you 3 back. Thanks very much. We have some questions from our audience. The first one, Sally, is for you. This is from Laura Engel. My question is about Helen Frick's relationship with Malvina Hoffman. Hoffman did a series of photographs of Helen as a study for her portrait bust. These images were done right before her father died. Do you think the destruction of the completed bust might be related to the proximity of these 2 events, the creation of the sculpture and the demise of her beloved father?
Well, the sculpture was destroyed, as far as we can tell, after 1956, which is a long period of time between, when it was executed and when it disappeared. So I'm not really sure. I've seen the photographs. There's a whole series of them at the Getty. Were quite beautiful, that were taken that Malvina Hoffman asked Miss Frick to have taken in order for her to produce the bust that she did. They remained friends, until Malvina Hoffman's death. So I think the intensity of their friendship might have waned over time. It was certainly at its sort of most pronounced in these earlier years, from what I've read. But I'm not sure. I mean, it is a bit of a mystery because we really don't know if, in fact, Miss Frick did this. There was a label on it saying that she did on this plaster bust, but it was it's still still not quite evidence enough for me to say definitively that was what it was. But I think their connection was a very strong one, certainly.
Okay, thank you. Next, I have a question for Sandrine from Kimberly Smith. Sandrine, can you speak a bit more about what it means to read archives against the grain?
Yes. So by that, I meant that archive may be collected for one reason, and sometimes if you need to, or if you are looking or doing some research on women, you may need to look at this archive for different reasons. So for instance, like here we had the inventories of collections and expert reports, and you would not necessarily think that's where you would find a lot of information about women, but you did. I mean, we did, and I think that's a lot of sometimes and often the case when you just have to look at archives and really try to find information in those archives that relates to women. And you really need to want to do this work because it's not necessarily obvious. So that's why I meant by reading the archive against the grain.
Great.
Exactly.
Thank you. Thank you. The next question from Charlotte Don Vito is for Samantha. You refer to women using men's names in their professional lives. Have you been able to identify any male names of auctioneers and other auction house employees named in catalogs which may have been women using pseudonyms?
Unfortunately, no. It was so complicated just to unearth this one name. And I'm talking about like countless hours going through our digital collection specifically, and just using external resources to find this one name. And I was fortunate to find a name. Does that mean that they don't exist? Absolutely not. They do. And that's why we need to like put our heads together and do some deep dive. Unfortunately, no, though, I don't have an answer right now for a specific person, but I'd like to continue researching this. I found it very interesting. And yeah, so thank you. Thank you for that question. I'm sorry, I don't have a positive response.
All right, I have another question for Sally from Dawn Green. Thank you for the Pittsburgh shout out. Interested to learn about women dealers who sold to Frick. Did Frick purchase artwork from Elsie DeWolf for only furnishings and antiques?
Hi, Dawn. Well, I think it was, Elsie DeWolf, really, I didn't talk about her at all because she's a topic for her own, session, I think, but she really had a great deal of influence on certainly the second floor of the Frick collection. Frick corresponded warmly with her over a number of years, and she also sold a great deal to him. I do not have any record. I don't think we have anything where she sold him art. She may have offered art. I don't know that he actually bought it from her. He really focused his interest in her, the furnishings that she was able to sort of bring his way to the house. Also, yes, and that from and we have a whole series of really fascinating letters with Elsie DeWolf, which have to do with the furnishing of the mansion. But I will actually go back and check on that. The true expert is not me on Elsie DeWolf and our building, so I will. I'll take that question back to somebody else and get back to you, Dawn.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Veronique Shannon-Burke, who's a future panelist. It's to Sandrine. Marie Dagoul, she does not talk much about her own taste when she writes about art. Do we know about her collection a bit?
So I unfortunately don't know the answer to that question, but I think looking at the inventories that Farrell made, which was made after her death, actually would be a beginning, of information, because you have a list of paintings that she had at her house at the time. So I guess you can, probably gather or start to gather some information about her taste from, what was actually hanging in her house. So that's where I would start maybe, but I don't really have another answer. I'm also going to say that somebody asked about WADA and how can we access the woman dealer archives. And this is something Veronique is working on right now. And I think if I'm correct, it should be launched next year. So not just right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Samantha, here's another one for you. This is from Ludovico Baldelli. Would it be possible to know more about the research process that brought you to discover the identity of Miss E. Barlow, other than what you told us? I mean,
Yeah, there was a lot that I could not fit in my 10-minute presentation.
Sure.
It took a lot of editing down. But long story short, so I was using the WPI sales catalog database, which is a database that includes over 11,000 digitized sales catalogs, all pre-1945 from around the world. And you could use it with different keyword searches. So it has optical like functionality, so OCR. And honestly, it was a lot of trial and error trying to find just a female presence using keywords as miss, widow of, property of, as I mentioned. And I just knew that I needed to keep digging. And then honestly, it was a blur. And then all of a sudden I stumbled on this person's name and then where to find who this E. Barlow was. And just to fast forward again, my colleagues, both Sandrine and my colleague, Jennifer Gimlet, who will actually be participating in a talk next week. So join us for that webinar. We put our heads together and we did the impossible, honestly. We were able to find her name written in a book of Richard Lacey. But honestly, it started with a very unknown blog online of this women who are in business. Very small, just someone who's interested in, acknowledging women enduring throughout history who, similar to the topics that we're going to be addressing in this webinar series. And it was like eureka. Like how did we find this person? And it was interesting because all these like little pieces of puzzles started piecing together. And then Emily Millicent Sowerby was also part of that. And I remembered reading her on Sotheby's website. It was just incredible. I don't, to this day, I still don't believe that I was able to like create this case study. I was really confident to find a female auctioneer during that period. And I know I was setting the goal very high. So I'm incredibly thankful to my colleagues for helping me try to locate who this E. Barlow was. And I was able to. So yeah, that was a little
great. And also Carol Green has just sent to our Q&A a hyperlink to Women Who Mean Business, if that's the
women. Yeah, thank you very much, Carol. Yes. It's a really interesting article.
Thank you very much. So many questions here. Let me go up to Norwood Creech asks Sally. Sally mentioned more than one conflict whereby Ms. Frick withdrew her support and one about doing her own thing. Might there have been a theme behind these conflicts? That's a shaded way of saying, was she a little prickly? What do you think?
Yes, I think she certainly was. You never quite know. Some of it was a very specific incident that would finally say, where she would just say enough. Other people have written more about this. Certainly, they have more expert opinions on this than I do. But she did tend to sort of hit. Something would happen, and she would say, "That's it. No more discussion. I'm finished. Goodbye. I'm taking my things and I'm leaving." For various reasons. But she was definitely a very strong-minded person and had very definite views about really everything, about the way the collection looked, the way her art department should be run. I think she felt very much that the money was coming from her. A lot of things were, and so she could steer things in a way that, ultimately she would butt heads with somebody and it would end. This is not to say that her whole life was like this, but it was as an adult woman, I think she had her she had difficult relationships with people, and it was often men. So
yeah,
she just said, I don't need you anymore, and I don't have to listen to you, and that's it.
Right.
Your loss. So.
She had that privilege that she could.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Sally, while I have you, I have one question here from Mylan. He said, hello, Mylan. I understand the Morgan is working on a large exhibition on Belle DeCosta Green. Any overlap relationship with the Fricks?
I know. I've heard they're doing this wonderful show. The library has some connections with Belle DeCosta Green, back and forth correspondence when she was, when she was there, and that also was at, but not directly with a couple of letters with Mr. Frick, really, but it's not substantial. I mean, the biggest connection for us is that Frick bought so many all porcelains and enamels and sculptures, a lot of things from Morgan's estate. And that's where the big connection comes in with the Morgan.
Okay, and then from Linda Maria Grasso asks, did Helen Frick have any connection to Tracy Morgan women's clubs or modernist women artists?
Modern, no, that's not really a Miss Frick's vocabulary. It wasn't. But I think she was a member of the Cosmopolitan Club in New York. I know that. And I'm not sure what her other ones were. We have a complete list of her her clubs that she joined, and I'd be happy to provide that if someone wanted. Just as I said, email archives@frick.org, and either I'll answer it or one of the other two archivists who work in the department can also handle it too.
Great. Okay. We've got so many questions. I'm going to try to race through these. One of them, Sandrine, this is for you, from Lucy Brownson. Thank you all for your fantastic talks. A question for all three of you. Sandrine made a really interesting point regarding not heroicizing or pitying these women, and I wonder how you can check this impulse in your own work. Additionally, how can we bring to light these women's achievements whilst accounting for the problematic nature of some of their work? Very interesting. Sandrine, you want to take that first?
Yeah, I mean, I framed it as a question because I don't really have any definitive answer either. I just know that I try in my own work at least to keep some distance with my subject, and as much as it can be frustrating to see how some of these women have been erased completely from history, in the process of recovering them, you also find records that might not be very put them in a very good light either, and I don't think we should actually not or refuse to discuss those records as well. I just put one slide with this one woman who lends this painting to this charitable exhibition in the support of the colonization of Algeria. And this is one example that I found in the archive, but I'm sure there is many more. And so, trying to provide a more nuanced and complicated picture of this woman's contribution is to me very important, because we're not just trying to transform create heroines or victims of the history. So it's a very sensitive question, and something that we need to, I think, address in our work whenever we talk about women.
Great. I have time for one more question, but just before I begin, a lot of you are asking to see particular slides, and also if this presentation is recorded. Yes, it is recorded. It will be broadcast or available to watch again, I believe, in about a month from now. So stay tuned. All of our presentations are recorded. So if you're asking for another view of slides and things like that, come back later. Also, if I didn't get to your question, I apologize. They're more generally addressed, and perhaps our attendees can write back individually. I have one question specifically for Samantha, and this is the last one that I'll have for this session. Sam, as far as I recall, women were active in the auction business in the 17th and 18th centuries in France and Amsterdam as appraisers. How does that relate to the situation in the 19th and first half of the 20th century?
It's a great question. I can't answer it fully. Unfortunately, I feel like, especially just for my personal research, I'm not an expert in this field, generally interested. But I believe with my presentation, I kind of just began to skim the surface. And of course, there's just so much more to learn about. I think for us, just to focus on the 19th and 20th century, especially in France with the Napoleonic Code, you're coming from the war. The government was sort of rebuilding itself and establishing laws that I think a lot of women, before the code was created, had a little bit more flexibility. That's to my understanding. Unfortunately, I don't know too much about laws in France and Amsterdam prior, but just from what I was able to gather, there was more flexibility and some more exceptions to the rule. But when these new policies and laws were implemented, it put a lot more restrictions on women. So I'm sure you're right. But unfortunately, I can't touch more beyond my knowledge. But thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you all. And everyone, thank you for tuning in and watching us. Please join us next week, same time, same place, for session 2 which is digital research methodologies featuring me and largely my colleague Jennifer Gimlet on Madam X Women Collectors, and Louisa Wood Ruby and Samantha Deutsch of the Frick on transforming research methodologies, a digital approach. So until then, enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks very much for joining us. Bye-bye.